In a high-stakes televised debate, Jasmine Crockett and Laura Ingraham collide over the future of immigration in America. One fighting for human dignity, the other defending border security. The heat intensifies as Crockett passionately defends millions of undocumented immigrants living in fear, while Ingraham pushes for draconian policies that could tear families apart. What follows is a public uproar, with Crockett winning massive support, while Ingraham's ratings crash. What explosive words did Jasmine say that sent shockwaves through the nation and changed everything? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The camera panned across the brightly lit studio, focusing on the two women who are about to clash on one of the most contentious issues in American politics. On one side sat Jasmine Crockett, the Democratic Congresswoman known for her unyielding stance on immigrant rights, and on the other side, Laura Ingraham, the conservative commentator whose fiery rhetoric often stirred controversy. The host's voice echoed through the studio as he set the stage for the debate, announcing, "Tonight, we have a special live broadcast. Two political heavyweights facing off on one of the most crucial topics of the moment, immigration reform." The atmosphere was electric, thick with anticipation. The host turned to Ingraham first, who began speaking with a steady, confident tone. But before the words could leave her mouth, the camera shifted to Crockett, her calm and collected expression making it clear she was ready for the battle ahead. The issue at hand was President Biden's newly proposed comprehensive immigration reform plan, which aimed to create a pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the clash of ideologies was about to unfold live, with millions watching. The host, sensing the gravity of the moment, introduced the debate. Tonight, we witness a confrontation between two opposing views on the future of immigration in America. Will we uphold justice, or will we retreat into fear and division? With that, the stage was set for an intense, no-holds-barred debate. As the tension in the studio mounted, the camera zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett. Ingraham's sharp words still hung in the air like a challenge, but Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her gaze unwavering, and in that moment, it felt like the entire room held its breath. With a calm yet commanding voice, she began her response, cutting through the heat of the debate. "Laura, with all due respect, you've missed the point entirely," she said, her words deliberate and powerful. Ingraham's face tightened, but Crockett continued, her voice steady as she dismantled every claim made moments before. "This isn't about flooding our country with people who are here to take advantage. It's about recognizing the undeniable contributions that immigrants make to the backbone of this nation." Her eyes never left Ingraham as she spoke, each sentence like a carefully aimed strike. Immigrants are not just workers, they are innovators, builders, creators. The very economy that supports our great nation would not stand without their labor. The weight of her words lingered in the air, the truth sinking in for those who were willing to listen. The room seemed to grow colder as Crockett pressed on, her voice growing more impassioned. "For too long, we've allowed fear and division to cloud our judgment. You talk about the dangers of immigration, but let me ask you, what about the danger of turning our backs on the people who are already here, who have already worked and struggled for a chance at the American dream?" She paused, letting the gravity of her statement settle over the crowd. "What about the dangers of denying asylum to those who flee violence, to the refugees who risk their lives to escape terror, only to be met with walls instead of the open arms that America once promised?" The host's eyes shifted nervously between the two, but Crockett wasn't done. These people, these families, are not the enemy. They are human beings seeking refuge, seeking hope in a country that has always stood for freedom. And yet you stand there, ready to turn them away. You speak of fairness, but what is fair about abandoning those who need us the most? Her words were sharp, piercing the atmosphere like a blade. Ingraham, unable to respond immediately, clenched her jaw, but Crockett was on a roll now. "Immigrants are not a threat. They are the lifeblood of this nation. You want to talk about national security? Our security comes from our ability to lead with compassion and strength, not fear and division. We can protect our borders and uphold the values that make America great. But you can't do that when you strip away the rights of those seeking refuge. That is the injustice we must confront, Laura. That is what you are perpetuating with every word you say. Her voice echoed through the studio, and for a brief moment, even Ingraham was silent. The tension was thick, palpable, almost unbearable. But Crockett wasn't finished yet. She turned her gaze to the camera, as if speaking directly to the millions watching at home. The truth is, she said, her voice softening, but carrying the weight of a generation's struggle. America's greatness doesn't come from its walls. It comes from the hearts of its people, and it's time we remember that. The studio was silent for a beat, the tension hanging thick in the air, before Ingram's icy voice broke through. Her eyes locked onto Crockett, her lips curling into a determined sneer. "Jasmine," she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice dripping with disdain. "You can speak all you want about fairness and compassion, but let's talk about reality. What you're advocating for isn't justice, it's chaos." She paused for effect, the words settling like stones in the room. "These democratic policies you support aren't solutions. They're a direct threat to our national security, and they're a ticking time bomb for our social welfare system." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing the gravity of the conflict. Ingraham continued, her voice rising. "You want open borders, but what you're forgetting is the impact of unchecked immigration. People are pouring in without the proper checks, creating a strain on our schools, our hospitals, and our economy. These policies don't protect the American people. They endanger them. You're weakening the very fabric of this nation." The studio seemed to vibrate with each of her pointed words. Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her expression steady, but the fire in her eyes was undeniable. Ingraham wasn't done, though. "You call it compassion," she snapped, "but how compassionate is it to ignore the reality that millions of people, many of them unvetted, are entering this country? How compassionate is it when American taxpayers are footing the bill for illegal immigration, for people who don't pay into the system?" Her words were fast, like daggers thrown with surgical precision. "I know you don't want to face it, but your open borders agenda is creating an unsustainable pressure on every aspect of our society." The studio seemed to hold its breath as Ingraham continued her tirade, now visibly enraged, pacing slightly in her seat. "And don't talk to me about human rights," she shot back, her voice ice cold. "When you flood this country with people who don't belong here, you not only jeopardize our safety, but you also place an unbearable burden on our public services. Law-abiding citizens are the ones who suffer, Jasmine, the very citizens you claim to protect." Crockett's gaze didn't waver. "What's truly dangerous, Laura, is allowing fear and misinformation to dictate policy," she fired back, her voice firm but controlled. "You've spent so much time demonizing immigrants that you've lost sight of the truth. People seeking refuge aren't invaders. They are humans, fleeing violence and terror. You keep talking about economic strain, but let's talk about the human cost of denying asylum to those who need it most." Her words were measured, yet they carried an undeniable weight, cutting through the chaos in the room. The tension in the studio became palpable as both women locked eyes, neither willing to yield. Ingraham's face tightened with frustration, but Crockett didn't back down. "You want to talk about safety? You want to talk about pressure on public services? How about the pressure you're putting on this country's moral integrity by treating immigrants like criminals?" Her voice grew louder, her intensity growing with every syllable. "You are perpetuating a lie, Laura, and it's hurting this country." The argument reached a fever pitch, the room crackling with energy as both women dug in their heels, the weight of their words hanging in the air like a final warning. Neither side was willing to concede an inch. Ingraham shot back, "This is not a game, Jasmine. This is about protecting America, its people, its jobs, its future. You're playing politics, and in the process, you're sacrificing the very security this nation was built on." Crockett's voice rang out, powerful and unwavering. "And I will not sit idly by while you use fear to divide us. We are better than that, Laura." The debate raged on, both sides relentlessly clashing, with no sign of resolution in sight. The stakes had never been higher, and the battle over immigration reform was only just beginning. The air in the studio felt electric, the weight of the debate pressing down on everyone in the room. The tension was palpable as Ingram's forceful claims lingered in the air. But Crockett was calm, poised, determined not to let the narrative slip away. Leaning slightly forward, she locked eyes with Ingram, her voice unwavering as she began her counterpoint. "Laura," she began, her voice steady but cutting, "you continue to paint immigrants as a threat. But let's talk about facts, not fear-mongering. Let's talk about the real contributions immigrants make to this country. The contributions that are too often ignored or dismissed." The audience was silent, hanging on every word, as Crockett flipped through her notes. A moment later, the screen behind her flashed with statistics, bold and undeniable. "Did you know," she continued, "that immigrants represent over 17% of the workforce in America? They are integral in industries like agriculture, construction, and service sectors, sectors that keep this country moving forward." She paused for a moment, letting the numbers sink in, knowing that Ingraham couldn't easily ignore them. "Immigrants aren't just laborers. They are essential to the very fabric of our economy. Without their work, entire industries would crumble." The room remained still, the sharp contrast between their perspectives clear. Ingram's eyes narrowed, the challenge now clear. She wasn't about to back down. "Really?" she shot back, her voice dripping with skepticism. "You want to talk about contributions? Let's talk about the costs. More and more people are entering this country without any regard for the rules. They aren't just workers. They are a strain on our resources. They overwhelm our schools, our hospitals, our welfare systems. This isn't about economics. It's about national survival." Crockett didn't flinch. "That's the problem, Laura," she said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "You talk about costs, but you fail to see the true cost of your narrative. Immigrants, particularly those who've been here for years, paying taxes, raising families, contributing to society, they are not the problem. The problem is the fear and misinformation you're spreading. People like you are making it harder for those who already contribute to this country to be seen as anything more than a burden." The intensity in the studio spiked as Ingraham responded sharply, "Fear? This is reality, Jasmine. We have terrorists, criminals, and cartels taking advantage of these policies. Unchecked immigration leaves us vulnerable. It makes us weak. The more we let in without any oversight, the more we risk becoming a nation that no longer controls its borders or its future." She pointed a finger toward Crockett, as if accusing her personally. "Your policy isn't humanitarian. It's dangerous." Crockett stood her ground, never losing her composure. "And yet, your dangerous rhetoric has led to policies that tear families apart. You talk about security, but where is the security in dividing families? In denying people the right to seek refuge and safety?" Her voice sharpened, taking on a deeper intensity. "You talk about crime, but here's the truth. Immigrants are actually less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. Studies show that areas with higher immigration rates tend to have lower violent crime rates. The very narrative you're pushing is a lie, Laura." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Ingram's expression shifted, her eyes flashing with frustration. She was stunned, but not yet beaten. "You can show all the statistics you want, but the reality is that unchecked immigration creates an environment where anything can happen, where bad actors can slip through the cracks and cause harm. You can't ignore the very real threat that people who have no intention of contributing to society are using these policies to their advantage." Crockett shook her head, her tone unwavering. "That's the false dichotomy you're presenting, Laura. Immigrants, regardless of their status, are not the enemy. They are people, human beings seeking a better life. They are not criminals. You speak of the fear of invasion, but you fail to acknowledge the human cost of what you're proposing. You want to shut down opportunities for these people, and for what? Because you're afraid of what you don't understand?" Her words were now like a call to arms, challenging Ingraham and everyone listening. "We cannot continue to let fear dictate our policies. The real threat is not immigrants. The real threat is the fear-based policies that seek to divide us, that seek to make us forget who we are as a nation." Ingraham, visibly shaken, leaned back, her eyes narrowing as she tried to regain control of the debate. But Crockett wasn't done. She finished with one last statement, her voice ringing out across the studio. The true danger, Laura, is the dangerous rhetoric you spread. Rhetoric that fuels division and hurts the very people who built this country. Immigrants are the backbone of America, and we can't afford to let people like you tear it down. The silence that followed was deafening. The intensity in the room was palpable. Both women holding their ground, the fate of the argument hanging in the balance. The debate had shifted, and the stakes had never been higher. The tension in the studio reached a boiling point. Ingraham's words had struck hard, and for a moment the entire room seemed to pause, holding its breath. Crockett had laid out the facts with a quiet yet undeniable force. But now it was Ingram's turn to strike back, and she did so with a sharpness that cut through the growing intensity in the room. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a cold, calculating precision. "Jasmine," Ingraham began, her voice thick with disdain, "you talk about compassion and justice, but your policies are nothing more than a fantasy. You want to open the doors wide, without regard for the consequences. This is idealism at its worst, completely divorced from the reality we face every day. You're so focused on your vision of what should be that you're ignoring what actually is." Her gaze locked on Crockett, and the words that followed felt like a personal attack. "This isn't just about compassion, it's about real security, real safety for American citizens. What you're advocating for puts everyone at risk. Unchecked immigration is a breeding ground for criminals, drug cartels, and potentially even terrorists." Her voice was sharp now, rising with each point she made. "And what do we get in return for your utopian vision? A drain on our resources, overwhelmed schools, overcrowded hospitals, and the very real possibility that our national security will be compromised. These people aren't coming here to contribute. They're here to take advantage of a system that's already under strain." The room buzzed with the sharpness of her words, and for a brief moment, Ingraham paused to let the weight of her statement settle. But Crockett, not missing a beat, shot back with a calm yet undeniable fury. She leaned forward in her chair, her posture tall and strong, as if every ounce of her being was ready to meet Ingraham head-on. Her voice was steady, but it carried the force of someone who had spent years fighting for what she knew was right. "Laura," Crockett responded, her tone cutting through the tension like a blade, "you've spent so much time stirring up fear, so much time painting a picture of immigrants as criminals, that you've forgotten something. Immigrants, the people you're so quick to demonize, are not the threat. The real threat is the narrative you've built, the one that uses fear and division to push a political agenda. These people aren't criminals. They're human beings. They're mothers, they're fathers, they're workers, and they come here seeking safety, seeking opportunity." Ingraham didn't back down, her face reddening with frustration. "You can call them whatever you want, Jasmine, but the facts speak for themselves. You want to open up the gates without any regard for the consequences. But the consequences are real, and they'll be felt by every American who has to foot the bill for your open border policies. You can't just ignore the strain it puts on the system. It's not just about humanitarian concerns. It's about the safety and well-being of Americans." Crockett shook her head slowly, her expression hardening. "What's truly dangerous, Laura, is your failure to see the truth. You keep hiding behind the false narrative of crime and terrorism. But the truth is, immigrants, especially those seeking asylum, are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. Studies have shown that in areas with higher immigration, violent crime rates are lower than in areas with fewer immigrants. You're using fear to justify policies that harm innocent families, families who are just trying to survive, just trying to make a better life for themselves." Ingraham's jaw clenched. She was visibly seething now, but Crockett didn't give her a chance to respond before she pressed on. "You want to talk about national security, Laura? Then let's talk about the real threat, the threat that comes from sowing division, from tearing families apart, from turning our backs on people who are literally running for their lives. That is what your policies are doing. You're feeding a system that dehumanizes people, that puts them in danger simply for seeking refuge." For a split second, the room fell silent. Ingraham, for all her bluster, was momentarily at a loss for words. But then she shot back, her voice filled with anger. "You can't just keep making excuses for people who are breaking the law, Jasmine. We cannot afford to prioritize the needs of those who aren't supposed to be here over the needs of American citizens. Crockett's response was immediate, her voice rising with the force of everything she had been fighting for. What's the real cost here, Laura? The real cost is when we turn our backs on the very principles that make America what it is. The real cost is when we shut the door on people who are trying to escape violence, who are trying to find safety for their families. The real cost is when we forget that this nation was built on the backs of immigrants. Immigrants who worked hard, who contributed to building the America we have today. The energy in the room was palpable now. Ingraham's face was red with frustration, but Crockett wasn't backing down. She was on fire now, her passion and conviction filling every word. And the real threat is when we allow fear to guide our policies, when we choose division over unity. The real threat, Laura, is letting rhetoric like yours destroy the very soul of this nation. The room was electric, each word exchanged in this fierce battle of ideologies, a reflection of the deeper, more personal stakes at play. Neither woman was willing to concede an inch. The debate had gone from a battle of policies to a battle for America's values, and there was no end in sight. The tension could have been cut with a knife, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been. The atmosphere in the studio shifted. The harshness of Ingram's rhetoric had filled the room, and the tension between her and Crockett was palpable. For a moment, Crockett sat in silence, eyes steady, as if weighing her next words carefully. Then, with a calm but undeniable purpose, she pressed a button on her tablet, signaling to the crew behind the scenes. The screen behind her flickered to life, and the audience fell into an expectant hush. Ingraham shifted in her seat, a slight frown tugging at her lips as she realized what was about to happen. The video began to play. The footage showed immigrants, people from all corners of the globe, speaking directly to the camera. Their faces were filled with hope, determination, and strength. Each person shared their story of coming to America seeking a better life, a common dream, now realized. One man from El Salvador described how he had arrived as a young boy with nothing but the clothes on his back, only to build a successful career in tech. A woman from Mexico spoke about the small restaurant she had opened, now employing dozens of Americans and supporting her family. Another story followed, this time a woman from the Philippines who had started as a home health aide and worked her way up to a managerial position, providing jobs to others in her community. As the stories unfolded, Crockett remained calm and focused. She knew the power of these stories. They spoke for themselves. Each person in the video represented the very essence of the argument she had been making. Immigrants are not the criminals or the burden that some want to claim. They are the workers, the innovators, the dreamers, who contribute to the fabric of this nation every single day. They are not outsiders. They are part of the American story. When the video ended, the room was thick with silence. Ingraham's confident, dismissive posture had faltered. For the first time in the debate, her eyes were not fixed on Crockett with challenge or scorn. Instead, there was a flicker of discomfort, a crack in her otherwise unyielding demeanor. She looked from the screen back to Crockett, but the words she had prepared to combat the video were suddenly far less certain. The silence was broken by Crockett, who didn't need to fill the space with words, but simply let the weight of the moment linger. These are just a few of the millions of immigrants who have come to this country and built something. They have worked hard, they have contributed, and they are as much a part of America as anyone who was born here. Her voice was calm, but it carried the force of a truth that could not be ignored. You can keep using your fear tactics, Laura, but these are the people who make America stronger every single day. Their stories are the true reality, not the fearful narrative you're trying to spread. Ingraham, clearly rattled by the shift in the room's energy, struggled to regain her composure. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk as she leaned forward, eyes narrowing as she began to speak. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp but noticeably lacking its previous bite. "You can show a few success stories, Jasmine, but they don't change the big picture. The real issue here is the uncontrolled influx of people into this country. You want to pretend that these success stories are the norm, but that's just not the reality." Ingraham took a deep breath, trying to recover, but the cracks in her defense were now visible. "You can paint this as a simple humanitarian issue, but the truth is, this country cannot bear the cost of such wide-open immigration. The burden on the system, on social services, on schools, on healthcare, it's simply too great. But Crockett wasn't finished. She stood taller now, every word she spoke cutting through the haze of Ingraham's deflections. The real cost, Laura, is turning our backs on people who have nothing left but hope. The real danger is shutting the door on the very people who are fighting for a chance, who want to contribute and build their futures here, just like so many before them. What you're doing, what you're advocating, is not about safety or security. It's about fear. It's about creating division where there should be unity. Her voice, strong and steady, rang through the room. Ingraham, for the first time in the debate, was at a loss for words. The video had hit hard, and no amount of rhetoric could easily undo the truth displayed before her. She took a moment, her lips pressing together tightly as she steeled herself for the next round. Her gaze flickered briefly toward the camera before shifting back to Crockett, but the confidence in her eyes had dimmed. The room had shifted. The audience, who had been silent but watching intensely, could feel the tension rise again. The real argument had now been framed, not in terms of fear or immigration rates, but in terms of the human cost of ignoring those who desperately needed America's protection. And in that moment, the true stakes of this debate became clear to everyone watching. The question was no longer about policies, it was about values, compassion, and the very soul of the country. Crockett had delivered a blow that wasn't just rhetorical, it was real, undeniable, and human. And now the pressure was on Ingraham to respond. Would she retreat into the same tired arguments, or would she finally confront the truth that Crockett had laid bare? The debate was far from over, but the course had been set, and Ingraham was facing a turning point she hadn't anticipated. The studio had become a battleground of words, and the air was thick with the weight of every sentence. Ingraham's attack on the current immigration system hung heavily in the room, but Crockett wasn't going to let the conversation devolve into fear-mongering and divisiveness. She listened intently as Ingraham finished, then leaned forward slightly, her face calm, but her eyes hardening with resolve. "Laura," she began, her voice firm but measured, "you talk about a broken immigration system, one that you say is letting in people who aren't contributing, who aren't following the rules. But let me tell you something. This system may be flawed, but it's not the immigrants who are the problem. It's the system itself that's failing, not the people who are seeking a better life." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the audience. The silence was almost deafening, but she wasn't finished. "Your idea of a better system is nothing more than a gatekeeper, designed to keep the most vulnerable out, under the guise of economic benefit. It's about keeping the status quo, not recognizing the human beings that make this country thrive." She took a deep breath, her voice rising with more passion. "The truth is, immigrants, both documented and undocumented, are part of the foundation of this country. They work hard, they build businesses, they contribute to our communities in ways that you can't measure with a paycheck or an employment form. Immigrants aren't a burden on this country, they're a lifeblood, especially in industries like agriculture, construction, and service, the ones that keep our economy moving. And yet you stand here calling for a system that privileges the rich, the powerful, the already established. How does that fit with the values we claim to hold as a nation?" There was a shift in the air, a palpable tension as Crockett continued. "You want to create a system that only lets in people who can contribute financially. You want a system that makes immigrants feel like they have to prove their worth before they're allowed to be a part of this country. But what about the refugees? What about the families fleeing violence, fleeing oppression, fleeing death? What about their worth? What about their humanity?" Her words were sharp, but they were filled with a deep, aching truth. Ingraham didn't flinch, but her expression hardened. She had clearly anticipated Crockett's rebuttal, but the force of her words was undeniable. Still, Ingraham was resolute. She leaned forward, locking eyes with Crockett, her voice turning cold and steady. "Jasmine, you can't ignore the reality. The current system is broken, and you want to make it even looser. The problem is that we are facing a crisis. Immigration isn't just about helping people. It's about the impact on American citizens, on their jobs, on their safety, and on the future of this country." Her voice grew more intense. "We have to prioritize America's interests. It's not about compassion. It's about national security. The more people we let in without proper vetting, the greater the risk we face. We are inviting criminals, drug cartels, and potential terrorists to exploit our system. And for what? A false sense of humanitarianism that puts everyone else at risk? Crockett's eyes flashed with anger, but she remained calm, refusing to let Ingram's words shake her. And there it is, Laura. There's the real threat, not the immigrants, but the fear you're feeding. You're demonizing people who are running for their lives, who are coming here to escape the very same dangers you claim to be afraid of. But what you don't understand is that America's strength isn't in shutting its doors. It's in its ability to welcome people in need. You're telling us to shut the door to people who deserve a chance at life just because they don't meet your idea of what's economically useful. Her voice dropped, becoming softer but no less determined. America is not a business, Laura. It's a country built on the principle of freedom and compassion. Our immigration policy should reflect that, not the idea that people are only valuable if they fit into a narrow economic mold. We need a system that evaluates people based on their humanity, not just their potential to contribute financially. Refugees, asylum seekers, and those fleeing persecution have a right to seek safety here, and it's our moral obligation to help them. There was a brief pause, the studio now hanging on Crockett's words. She had shifted the debate, moved it beyond the confines of economics, and into something far more fundamental. Ingram's expression flickered with frustration, her lips tightening as she tried to form a response. But it was clear that Crockett had landed a critical blow. In the end, Laura, Crockett continued, her voice unwavering, our immigration system needs to be smart, but also just. It needs to recognize the value of people, not just their potential to pay taxes, but their right to live. We cannot continue to exclude those who have nothing but the hope of a better life. The moral failure would be in shutting them out, not in letting them in. The room was still, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Ingraham was visibly flustered now, but her defense was no longer as sharp as before. The facts were on the table, and the debate had shifted from politics to ethics, from fear to compassion. It was clear that Crockett was fighting not just for a policy, but for something much more profound, the soul of a nation. The debate had reached a boiling point, the tension in the room palpable as both women stood their ground. Ingraham, her face flushed with frustration, had just finished attacking Crockett's immigration reform proposal, accusing her of ignoring the very real dangers of unchecked immigration. The sharpness of her words echoed in the studio, but Crockett remained calm, her gaze unwavering. She knew what was at stake, and she wasn't about to let her opponent's rhetoric define the conversation. Without hesitation, Crockett spoke, her voice steady but powerful. Laura, you've made it clear that you think immigrants are a threat, an economic burden, a security risk. But what you fail to see is that the system itself is broken. It's not the immigrants who are the problem. It's the system that has been designed to keep them out, to dehumanize them, and to treat them as second-class citizens. Her words were deliberate, each one landing with precision. The truth is, our current immigration system doesn't serve anyone. Not the immigrants, not the American citizens, and certainly not the nation as a whole. What we need is a system that is fair, humane, and effective. She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle, her eyes fixed on Ingraham. We need a system that allows deserving individuals to build a future in this country, one that doesn't just prioritize financial gain, but also considers the human dignity of each person seeking a better life. We cannot turn away people simply because they don't meet some narrow economic standard. The true measure of this country's greatness is how we treat the most vulnerable among us. The audience, silent and absorbed, hung on every word. Crockett had shifted the debate, not just arguing for policy changes, but making a moral case for the future of the nation. She wasn't just speaking about statistics or political ideals. She was talking about values, the very essence of what America stood for. She continued, her voice growing more impassioned. We need to end the criminalization of immigrants and instead focus on reform that respects their human rights. Because when we fail to do so, we lose what it means to be American. Compassion is not a weakness. It is our greatest strength. Ingraham's expression hardened as Crockett spoke. She was visibly frustrated, and it was clear that Crockett had touched a nerve. Ingraham was used to playing on fear, to painting immigrants as the enemy. But now she could see that the debate was moving beyond fear and into the realm of values. With a quick inhale, Ingraham shot back, her voice dripping with condescension. Jasmine, you keep talking about compassion and humanity, but let's get back to reality. What you're proposing isn't reform. It's a disaster. It's irresponsible. You want to open our borders, give amnesty to millions, and reward people who have violated our laws. What does that say about the integrity of our nation? Her voice grew more intense, fueled by frustration. You're so caught up in this idealistic vision that you're completely ignoring the security risks, the criminal elements that exploit our broken system. Your plan will only create more chaos, more danger, and more lawlessness. This is the reality, Jasmine. The room was thick with tension as Ingraham finished her tirade. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes daring Crockett to respond. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She was steady, unflinching, her voice cutting through the rising intensity. That's the problem, Laura, she said, her words deliberate and clear. You keep demonizing immigrants, portraying them as criminals, as threats to national security. But the real threat is not the people fleeing violence, the families seeking a better future. The real threat is the fear you're sowing. The real danger is turning people into scapegoats to distract from the true issues we face as a country. She leaned in slightly, her voice gaining momentum. Your vision for immigration reform isn't about solving problems. It's about perpetuating fear. Fear of the other, fear of change, fear of those who are different. And what you're failing to understand is that America has always been a nation of immigrants. We were built on the backs of those who came here seeking something better, who fought for their place in this country, who contributed to the strength and diversity of the nation. Crockett paused for a moment, letting the truth of her words settle in. What we need is not more division, but more understanding. We need a system that values people for who they are, not just their economic worth. We need to be the nation that welcomes the weary, the oppressed, and the vulnerable. That is what America stands for. And if we don't embrace that, then we are no longer the country that I believe in. The room was silent. The weight of the exchange hung in the air, thick and undeniable. The audience could feel the shift. It was no longer just a debate about policy, but about the soul of the nation. Ingraham, clearly rattled, tried to gather her thoughts, but her response came out halting and strained. I don't think you understand, Jasmine, she muttered, but her voice lacked the usual conviction. You're asking for a system that just isn't realistic. It's too much. It's too dangerous. Crockett looked at her, unyielding, her voice soft but full of power. What's dangerous, Laura, is to turn away from humanity. What's dangerous is to create a system that only sees people as numbers, as liabilities, as threats. We cannot afford to let fear guide us. Not now, not ever. The room was still, the energy thick, as the two women locked eyes, each holding her ground. The debate had reached a crossroads. Crockett had successfully shifted the conversation from fear-driven rhetoric to the true essence of the issue, human dignity. Ingraham was visibly shaken, but she wasn't ready to concede yet. This was far from over. The real fight was just beginning. The studio buzzed with tension, the heavy air crackling with the weight of the debate. Crockett had just delivered a powerful personal story, a story of immigrant success, of lives transformed through grit and hard work. But now it was time for Ingraham to respond, and her eyes narrowed with renewed intensity, clearly unimpressed by the emotional appeal. She leaned forward in her chair, her expression cold and calculated, ready to take the stage again. That's a touching story, Jasmine, she began, her voice smooth but sharp. But let's be real. Stories like the Ramirez family are exceptions, not the rule. You can't base national policy on a handful of success stories. The truth is that most immigrants who come here, especially illegally, don't become entrepreneurs or doctors. They don't open businesses or contribute to society. They place an enormous burden on our public services and our economy. And that cost is something that American taxpayers, who are already struggling, have to bear. Her words hit with the force of a blow, and the audience reacted with a quiet murmur, some nodding in agreement. Ingraham's tone was now a mix of confidence and frustration as she pressed her point. What's happening here isn't about compassion, Jasmine. It's about reality. Our country cannot afford to open its doors to everyone who wants to come here. The system is overwhelmed. Illegal immigration has created a crisis, one that threatens the safety, the jobs, and the resources of American citizens. Your policies will only exacerbate the problem, leading to more people coming here without the legal ability to stay, more strain on our hospitals, more children in overcrowded classrooms, and more crime. The accusation hung in the air like a sharp knife, but Crockett was ready. She had heard these talking points before, and she wasn't about to let them define the conversation. Ingraham wasn't just attacking a policy, she was attacking the humanity of those who had already suffered and sacrificed for a chance at a better life. With unwavering resolve, Crockett spoke, her voice steady and filled with the kind of calm that only came from knowing she was right. The real cost, Laura, is not the families who come here with nothing but hope in their hearts. The real cost is when we let fear and division dictate who is allowed to live in this country. The real cost is when we turn away those who are desperately fleeing violence, persecution, and death. You talk about the burden on American taxpayers, but what about the burden of turning our backs on the people who need us most? The studio fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Crockett didn't let up. We're not talking about numbers or statistics, Laura. We're talking about people, real people. Jose and Maria Ramirez didn't come to this country to take. They came to build. And they are not the exception. They are the rule. They are the future of America. When we close our hearts to those who need our help, we turn away from the very values that make this country great. She paused, letting the room absorb her words before continuing. What you're offering is a closed door, a door that shuts out the very people who have the potential to be part of the fabric of this nation. Your immigration reform, it isn't about security, Laura. It's about division. It's about fear. It's about keeping people out who have the courage to seek a better life, who have the willingness to contribute, to work hard, to build something with their own hands. You want to make them criminals, but they're not criminals. They're just people looking for a chance that America should be willing to give. Ingraham's lips tightened, her frustration palpable. But Crockett wasn't finished. She stood taller, her body language radiating confidence and determination. And Laura, you're right about one thing. We can't afford to ignore the costs, but we can't afford to ignore the human cost of what your policies would do to families like the Ramirez's. The cost of breaking up families, the cost of sending children back to countries where they face danger, where they face violence, where they have no future. The studio grew quieter still as Crockett let her final point land. The real danger is not the people who come here seeking refuge, seeking opportunity. The real danger is the policies that ignore the humanity of those people. The real danger is building a wall around our hearts instead of one around our borders. The room held its breath, the audience clearly moved by Crockett's unwavering stance. But Ingraham, not one to back down, quickly shot back, her voice brimming with anger. This is not about humanity, Jasmine. This is about keeping our nation secure. It's about protecting the American people from those who are coming here without regard for the law. Your vision is unrealistic. It puts everyone at risk, and the consequences will be disastrous. Her words echoed in the room, but this time Crockett was ready. And what's the cost of turning away those who have no other place to go? What's the cost of closing our hearts when the world needs us most? I'll tell you what the cost is. It's the soul of this nation. The debate was no longer just about immigration. It was a battle over values, over compassion, over what kind of America they both believed in. As Ingraham tried to find her footing again, Crockett had already shifted the conversation, reframing it as a matter of human dignity and moral responsibility. Neither woman was willing to give up, but in that moment, the stakes had never been higher. The audience could feel it, the palpable clash between fear and hope, between a vision of America as a fortress and one as a refuge for those in need. The debate had escalated, and now the fight was about something much bigger than policies. It was about the future of the nation. As the debate ended, The aftermath unfolded rapidly. The tension in the studio was palpable, but the real battleground was not in the room. It was in the hearts and minds of the millions watching across the country. Jasmine Crockett had made her case, not just through facts and figures, but through the human stories that she shared. Her unwavering stance on immigration reform had struck a chord with many, and as the broadcast came to a close, the reactions began to pour in. In the hours that followed, social media exploded with commentary. Hashtags like Bravery, Justice for Immigrants, and Crockett for Change began trending as people from all walks of life rallied behind her message. Her words had been powerful, but it was the personal connection she had made with viewers that turned the tide. Videos of her sharp yet compassionate defense of immigration reform circulated widely, shared by those who had felt a shift in their own thinking. The narrative had changed, and the force behind it was undeniable. The public began to recognize that Crockett wasn't just advocating for a policy, she was advocating for values. Her message was about dignity, compassion, and moral responsibility, values that transcended the economic arguments often used to limit immigration. The tide of public opinion, once dominated by fear-driven rhetoric, had shifted in her favor. Meanwhile, Ingraham could feel the ground beneath her slipping. Her response to Crockett had been rooted in fear, in warnings of threats to national security and the potential economic burden of immigration. But those arguments had been sharply challenged by the human stories Crockett had shared, and the public wasn't buying it anymore. Ingraham had always prided herself on being the voice of reason for many conservative viewers, the one who spoke truth to power. But now her arguments were met with an increasing backlash. The audience that had once been her loyal following was now splintering. A new narrative was rising, one that demanded compassion over division. As the debate over immigration policy continued to rage, Ingraham's show saw a marked decline in viewership. The statistics were telling. Ratings, once strong, were now beginning to wane, as more and more viewers were tuning out. The audience was shifting toward those who were speaking for a more inclusive, humane future. The damage didn't stop with lost ratings. Ingraham was now facing the consequences of her own rhetoric. Major advertisers began to pull their support from her program, hesitant to be associated with the increasingly controversial views she espoused. Brands that had once found comfort in her platform were now retreating, worried about the growing public disapproval. It wasn't just the numbers that were dwindling, it was the public trust in her message. As Ingraham watched her empire begin to erode, she found herself at a crossroads. She had built her platform by appealing to the fear of those who felt their way of life was being threatened. But Crockett had shown the country a new path, one where humanity and justice took precedence over fear. Meanwhile, Crockett's message was only gaining momentum. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She had become a movement, a symbol of the fight for immigrant rights and social justice. Her message had resonated not just with the left, but with a wide spectrum of people who were tired of division and wanted to see a country that truly embraced its ideals of compassion. Her social media was flooded with messages of support from people who had never seen the debate about immigration in such human terms before. By contrast, Ingraham was left struggling to reassert her influence, her once unshakable confidence now chipped away. The backlash had been swift and overwhelming. The same voices that had cheered her on in the past were now questioning the logic of her fear-driven rhetoric. She found herself on the defensive, unable to regain the momentum she once had. It was clear. The landscape had changed. Crockett had done more than win a debate. She had changed the conversation, and the nation was beginning to listen. The future of immigration policy was no longer just about border security. It was about humanity, about valuing people, not just their economic contributions. And in this fight, it was clear who was emerging as the new voice of America's conscience. The shift was unmistakable, and the moral high ground had found a new champion in Crockett. She was no longer just a politician. She was a symbol of the progressive future many were now clamoring for, a future that embraced immigrants, fought for justice, and challenged the status quo. As Ingraham's influence began to fade, Crockett was only growing stronger with the American people, and the conversation shifting toward her vision for a more inclusive, just society. As the debate concluded, The ripples of its impact spread far beyond the confines of the studio. The tension that had simmered throughout the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Laura Ingraham still lingered in the air, but now the focus shifted to what came after. The words Crockett had spoken resonated deeply with the millions watching at home. Ingraham's sharp attacks had been met with calm, reasoned responses, but it was Crockett's call for compassion and human dignity that struck a chord in the hearts of the public. Within hours, the landscape of the conversation had shifted entirely. The reaction from the audience was immediate. Social media exploded in a wave of tweets, posts, and hashtags, with number Justice for Immigrants trending on Twitter. The viral clips of Crockett's passionate defense of immigrant rights spread like wildfire across the internet, viewed by millions of people who hadn't been exposed to the conversation before. Crockett had done more than just argue her case. She had made people feel. The human stories she shared, the stories of families who had come to America seeking nothing more than a chance at a better life, had cut through the noise of fear and rhetoric that had dominated the discussion. For the first time, it seemed that America was hearing the voices of those who had been silenced for so long. Major civil rights organizations like the ACLU and Human Rights Watch quickly issued statements praising Crockett for her leadership and courage. They hailed her as a true champion of immigrant rights, someone who had the strength to stand up against the fear-mongering that had long shaped the national conversation on immigration. But it wasn't just the advocacy groups that took notice. Political figures from across the spectrum, even those who had previously opposed comprehensive immigration reform, began to express admiration for Crockett's unwavering commitment to justice. She had made the issue not about political gain or party lines, but about the moral responsibility to protect those who needed it most. As the public's response grew, the tide began to turn in Crockett's favor. The momentum was undeniable. The conversations on news networks shifted, with more and more reporters and commentators acknowledging the human element of the immigration debate, something that Crockett had so forcefully brought to the forefront. She wasn't just another politician. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of hope for those whose stories had been drowned out by political rhetoric. Meanwhile, Ingraham, who had once seemed so confident in her ability to control the narrative, found herself on the defensive. The backlash against her arguments came quickly. Viewers began to turn away from her show, frustrated by the narrow, fear-driven viewpoint she had espoused. Ratings for her program, once solid, began to decline steadily. More importantly, the tone of the conversation had begun to shift, and Ingraham's rhetoric seemed out of touch with a nation that was beginning to demand more from its leaders. Advertisers who had supported her show started pulling back, unwilling to be associated with the controversial views that were now drawing widespread criticism. Ingraham was not used to this kind of pushback. For years, she had cultivated a loyal following by leveraging fear and division. But now, in the face of Crockett's rationality, compassion, and moral clarity, her once unshakable position was cracking. The public no longer saw her as a voice of reason. They saw her as part of the problem, part of the divide that was tearing at the fabric of the nation. On the other hand, Crockett was only gaining momentum. Grassroots organizations from all over the country began organizing in support of her policies, rallying behind her call for comprehensive reform. Activists took to the streets, organizing rallies and marches in cities from coast to coast, demanding a change in the nation's immigration system. Crockett's voice had become a rallying cry for those who had been denied a seat at the table, for the undocumented, the refugees, and the families whose futures were being torn apart by an inequitable system. Her name was now synonymous with hope, hope for a better, more inclusive America. She wasn't just challenging the status quo. She was offering a new vision of what the country could be if it chose to act with justice and humanity. As Ingraham's show began to lose advertisers and viewers, Crockett's following grew. She was embraced by political groups and activists who had long been pushing for change, and they saw in her the possibility of a future where immigration was treated not as a problem, but as a part of the solution to the nation's growth and vitality. By the end of the week, Crockett had achieved something that seemed impossible just days before. She had shifted the conversation. She had not just won the debate, she had redefined the terms of the debate. Her message of justice for immigrants was not just a policy, it was a moral imperative that could no longer be ignored. In the process, she had inspired countless Americans, people from all walks of life, who now saw the immigration issue as one that touched the core of the country's values. As the support for Crockett continued to grow, Ingram's influence began to wane. The media was beginning to turn its focus away from her divisive narrative and toward the hopeful, inclusive message that Crockett had championed. Her voice, once so dominant in conservative circles, was now being drowned out by a movement that demanded a future built on compassion and human dignity. And while the fight for immigration reform was far from over, Crockett had already won a significant victory, not just for herself, but for the countless people who had been waiting for someone to stand up for them. She had not only challenged the narrative, she had transformed it. Her message had resonated with a country that was ready for change, and in that moment, Crockett had become more than a politician. She had become a symbol of the future, a future that was finally ready to embrace the values it was founded upon. The weight of the debate had settled into the room, but Crockett wasn't finished. She knew that the conversation could no longer stay within the walls of the studio. It had to extend far beyond the cameras, into the hearts and minds of every American who was watching, listening, and, most importantly, feeling. With the microphone in hand, she took a deep breath, and the energy in the room shifted. It was no longer just a political debate, it was a call to action. "This isn't just about immigration," Crockett began, her voice calm but laden with the urgency of what was at stake. "This is about who we are as a country. We are at a crossroads, and the decision we make today will echo in the generations to come." Her eyes scanned the room, but it felt as though she were speaking directly to the millions of people watching at home. For too long, fear and division have shaped our decisions. For too long, we've allowed racism, hate, and intolerance to guide us when it should be love, justice, and compassion. We cannot let that continue. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of the silence settle in. Then with conviction, she continued, "I am asking every one of you, no matter where you come from, no matter what your political beliefs are, no matter your race or background, to stand up. Stand up for those who have no voice, for those who have been left behind, for those who seek refuge, safety, and a better life in the land of the free." Crockett's voice grew stronger with every word. Immigration reform isn't just a policy, it's a moral issue. It's about human dignity. It's about respecting the basic rights of every individual who walks through our doors, who works hard to contribute to this nation, who raises their children to believe in the American dream. Her words rang with purpose, and the room seemed to lean in closer, as if each person was holding their breath, waiting for what she would say next. "You've seen the faces of immigrants, mothers, fathers, children, workers, students. These are the people who make this country great. These are the families who come here not to take, but to give, to contribute their sweat, their talent, their hearts to the land that promised them a better life. And yet for too long, they've been demonized, pushed aside, and forced to live in the shadows." Her eyes hardened, the steel of her resolve apparent. "We cannot let fear guide us any longer. We cannot continue to allow politicians, pundits, and media outlets to stoke the flames of division and hate. It's time to choose humanity over fear, justice over division. It's time to stand up against racism, to stand up for the rights of every immigrant who seeks a chance at a better future." The weight of the words hung in the air, and Crockett took a moment to breathe, letting the full weight of what she had just said settle in. The American dream isn't just for the privileged few. It's for everyone who dares to hope, to work, and to believe in the possibilities of a better tomorrow. And we, all of us, must protect that dream. It's not just our duty, it's our moral imperative. She stepped forward, her voice strong and clear. "I am calling on you to stand up, to raise your voice, to demand that the government protect human dignity, to protect the rights of immigrants, and to create a system that reflects the best of who we are as a nation. Stand up for compassion. Stand up for justice. Stand up for those who can't speak for themselves. Don't let fear and hatred define who we are. Let love, understanding, and justice be the guiding forces of our nation." The room erupted into applause, but Crockett wasn't finished. She raised her hand, calling for silence, allowing her final words to settle deeply in everyone's hearts. This is our moment, our chance to right the wrongs, to build a future where all people are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. We cannot afford to wait. This fight isn't just for today, it's for tomorrow. For our children, for our grandchildren, for the generations that will look back and ask, what did we do? We cannot fail them. We must act now. With that, she stepped back, her chest rising and falling with the weight of what she had just said. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a demand for action. It was a call to arms, a plea for justice that was impossible to ignore. Crockett had laid down the gauntlet, and the world had no choice but to respond. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.